Wow, 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 those practice sabers are too heavy. We should be using lighter ones. Get a grip, look at some real sabers. There's a massive variation in weights. Let's look at some examples. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. And in case you guys hadn't noticed, I've got quite a lot of swords. Some people would say I've got a bit of a sword problem, but I'm also a saber fencer, particularly in the milieu of the world of historical European martial arts. And this is the Coveton Easton Mark III. So this is one of the sabers that I've developed over the years. And I've developed others as well. I developed ones with Reginier and the Night Shop and various other people, and I'm sure I'll develop more in the future, and I have ongoing work with Coveton. More about that in the future. But one of the things I've noticed over the years is in the world of military saber or historical European martial arts saber, as opposed to modern Olympic style saber, there is some debate over what weight should the sabers be. And some people say, oh, those sabers are too heavy, they hit too hard, they're too heavy for my little arms. Well, first of all, get good. But secondly, the fact is there is a big variation in the weight of original sabers. Look, I'm actually not here to bully and make fun of people who want to use lighter sabers. I use lighter sabers. I use single sticks, which are super light. So the fact is you get something from those. Now, without going into depth about that, we're going to look at some originals. But the important point I want to note here is that the standard kind of competition weight for fencing sabers in the HEMA world at the moment is about between 750 and 900 grams. Now that might sound like a fairly broad range, but it's not as broad as the originals. Now, first up, some people go, oh, you're going to talk about cavalry sabers, aren't you? No, I'm not. I'm going to talk only about sabers intended to be used on foot. I'm kind of reluctant to use the word infantry officers' sabers here because actually they're not all. Some of them, in this example, I have one for a rifles officer, I have one for a Royal Engineers officer, which are both branches of the army, and I have one Royal Navy officer's sword. So although they're on foot, they're on a ship. They might sometimes be on land as well, but they're not on a horse usually. So we are looking at sabers here designed to be used on foot. Now, have I cherry-picked these? Not exactly. However, what happened is one of these swords is actually really light. So for those of you who like the lighter end of the spectrum, like those lighter sabers, I've got something here for you, so keep watching. But because I picked up this saber and I was like, that feels really light in the hand, and I started waving it around like a lightsaber, being incredibly quick with it, and I was like, wow, this is incredible, this is great fun, this has got to be pretty light. Or maybe I've just suddenly got really hench overnight. I didn't, spoiler. So I weighed the saber, and well, we'll look at it in a second. It was light, much lighter than I'm used to. And then I thought, well, that can't be right. I'll just grab a couple of other swords. I grabbed one completely at randomly, and I grabbed one which I thought might be on the heavier end of the spectrum. We'll look at them in a second. Now, full disclosure, I currently have in stock hundreds of swords. Okay, so these were three not cherry-picked. They were picked out. One was because I noticed it was light. We'll find out how light in a second. And the other two basically randomly. Okay, but I have weighed similar swords before, and we'll talk about my observations from that in a second. Now, let's have a look at these swords. And just before we do look at those swords, just to reiterate, these practice sabers tend to be about 800 to 850 grams, sometimes a bit above that, very rarely below that. So 800 to 850 grams. Remember that, I'm going to use metric for this video. So the first sword we're going to look at is a 1857 pattern British Royal Engineers officer's sword, mid to late, well, it's late Victorian actually, this one. My general observation of these swords is because of the nature of the hilt, being quite thick brass, they tend to be a little bit heavier than the average. Now, what is the average? Based on my observations from the past, the typical weight of infantry officers or Royal Naval officers' swords, so swords intended to be used on foot rather than on horseback, in the British Army for the whole Victorian period, in fact all the way into First World War, in fact into the 20th century, even today, the general weight range is usually between 750 grams and 850 grams. It should be no surprise, therefore, that that's why we fixed the weight for practice sabers that we use in HEMA, for those of us who are using British Army systems, that's why we fixed that weight range. Okay, that's why we centered and fixated on the 800 grams. But in addition to that, we've also got the British Army practice sabers, the 1864 pattern, the 95, the 99, so on and so forth. And these also weigh about 800 grams, generally speaking. So 800 grams is this kind of golden number, at least in British military, both practice and real swords. So how much did this weigh? Well, I've got to say, it surprised me. Obviously, without the scabbard, I put this on the scales. I have very accurate postal scales that I use for shipping swords all over the world. And this weighs 950 grams. Now, my observation is that if we put a practice saber out into the market with a center point of 950 grams, most people, probably even me, would say, it's a bit heavy. So, but it's not compared to the real thing. So this is a Royal Engineer sword, late Victorian, weighs 950 grams. So I would say that's at the upper end of the spectrum, but I have weighed a lot of swords in my life, and I have to say it's not at the top end of the spectrum. I have weighed infantry officer swords, which weigh over 1,000 grams. Okay, now in the grand scheme of things, that's not actually that heavy. That's as heavy as lots of medieval or dark age swords, as heavy as several types of ethnographic swords as well. So actually one-handed swords have a really big weight range, generally speaking between about 500 grams and about 1,500 grams. There are some Viking era swords that are crazy heavy for their size, and in fact, in fairness, actually, there's some late medieval swords, some arming swords, which are really pretty damned heavy for their size. So 500 to 1,500 grams, I mean, that's 3 times heavier than the 500 gram small sword, for example. So this is the overall weight range for most one-handed swords in the world throughout history, is 500 grams to 1,500 grams. And lo and behold, we find that the Victorian Royal Engineer sword is pretty much slap bang in the middle of that at just under 1,000 grams, 950 grams. So let's look at the light sword. And now, bearing in mind that weight range, you're going to realise now why this gobsmacked me. Okay, I knew it was light when I picked it up. So here it is. It's a silver-plated rifles officer's sword. So the scabbard is silver-plated, the hilt is the guard, and the back piece is silver-plated. How do I know it's silver-plated? Because of the colour of the tarnish. I haven't polished it or anything. This is how it came straight from auction, and it's still got the auction ticket on it. And the tarnish on it tells me that it's silver plate on steel or iron. Okay, so the minute I drew this out of the scabbard, I was like, whoa, that thing's like, it's like a buzzsaw. It's incredibly light and incredibly quick. I was like, that moves like insane. That moves almost like a modern fencing saber. So I stuck it on the scales, and how much did this weigh? 620 grams. That's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. A modern fencing épée can be up to 500 grams. They're usually not, but they can be up to. And in fact, a modern fencing saber, I think, can be up to close to 500 grams. So 620 grams is crazy light, but also put it into that context. And as we know, context is all important. That other one we just looked at was 950 grams, and this is 620 grams. Huge variation, and they don't look terribly different. You know, if you were looking at these in a, I don't know, a movie or a book or whatever, you wouldn't think that there was such a huge weight difference. They're the same length, they're the same width. It is purely down to details of the distal taper, the fuller, because one's got a deeper fuller than the other one, and broader fuller, and the guard construction. Steel guards tend to be lighter than brass guards because brass is softer, so it has to be made thicker, although it's not always. So 620 grams, 950 grams, crazy, crazy variation. I was like, whoa, that's almost like the bottom end and the top end of the spectrum for British infantry officers' swords. So I thought, let's just pick another random sword. Now, it just so happens I've got this really nice Wilkinson just come in. And this is a Royal Navy officer's sword. Now, it's not a standard one. I knew that this would be a little bit heavier than average because it's a Wilkinson one. It's one of their fighting designs. It doesn't have the folding section. It's got a solid guard. It's got a catch at the back. They're a little bit more substantial. But it's not a patent hilt, it doesn't have a non-regulation blade, it's got a regulation sized blade. I thought, yeah, I'll probably be a little bit on the heavy side. Let's weigh it. So, oh, and here's the blade. You won't see that because it's in lovely condition. I haven't researched this yet, but it does have a number on the back, which I'll look into. So I knew this would be a bit above average. Turns out it's almost exactly the same weight as the Royal Engineer sword. This is 940 grams. So crazy. And, you know, although that was more or less picked at random, but I did, when I picked it up, I did go, yeah, it's probably a bit heavier than average. I should point out that most of those swords, the infantry ones anyway, will weigh usually in the region of 800, 850 grams. In other words, the same weight as the practice sabers we use. And that's why they weigh that much. And that's why the original 1864 pattern practice saber that they used for practice in the British Army for officers weighed that much. Because that was the weight of the real sword. And as Hutton says in his own manual, he says you should use a practice weapon which weighs the same as the real weapon. And it was one of the common criticisms of single sticks was that they were too light, and soldiers who trained with them all the time, and then they picked up a real sword and they were like, oh, this is a bit heavy. So it's, yeah, you know, your muscles, your tendons, your grip strength, they build up to get used to the weight of the weapon that you're supposed to use in war or in self-defense. So there we go. Historically, across time, across the continents, one-handed swords have tended to weigh between 500 grams and 1500 grams, but those are extremes. It's unusual, and it's only particular parts of history where we get one-handers which weigh as much as 1500, and it's rare that we get one-handers as light as 500. That tends to be very particular types of swords, like small swords, which can even be even slightly less than that. But most one-handed swords tend to be in this sweet spot between about 700 grams and about 1100 grams. And if we're looking at military sabers, certainly British and French ones of the 19th century, for example, then they tend to be between about 700, 750 grams through to about 1000 grams. And we've seen some examples here at the top end of the spectrum and the bottom end of that spectrum, in fact even below the bottom end of that spectrum for the rifle sword. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting, and I hope it's interesting as well beyond just the sphere of British 19th century swords, because it actually applies to all one-handed swords throughout history. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, and I hope that I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks!